All right, well, I think I'll get us started here. I'll say welcome. This is the hatchery breakout session in our conference. I'm Jason Hwang with Pacific Salmon Foundation. It's my pleasure to be the session coordinator, moderator for today. Just to give you an idea of how we're going to plan to work this session, we've got 4 speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. And what we thought we would do, because these talks kind of have a connection to each other, in some cases they'll discuss further something that occurred in the previous talk. We're not going to take questions after each speaker, so if you could just hold any questions, what we'll do is we'll let everybody do their talks, then we'll be hanging out on these cushy white chairs. I'll probably ask an opening question or two to the panel, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So we're going to have, I think, Raphael or somebody from his team with a mic. So just you can put your hand up when we get to the question part of the day, and we'll take your questions at that time. So I'm just going to set a bit of context before I introduce our panel. If you remember from John Moore's talk this morning, he provided some stats. One of them that comes from a recent PSF product says that more than 70% of the salmon populations in BC and the Yukon are doing more poorly than the long-term average. So we have a context that is worrying for a lot of people who are concerned about salmon productivity, salmon sustainability, access to salmon for fishing, for cultural purposes, for the ecosystem. There are a lot of pressures out there, again, that John touched on in his talk, and other speakers throughout the day so far have touched on. There's been a historic development that salmon and their habitats have had to endure. There is ongoing pressure, and then there's this amplifying, complicating effect of climate change. And so what can we do? And people that have been in the salmon business will kind of appreciate the idea that there are these 3 or 4 levers we can pull. We can have habitat be better or be worse. We can think about how we harvest fish. We can harvest more or less or none. We can work on, at PSF, we think, one of the H's is salmon health. There are things that they're not necessarily fishery, they're not necessarily habitat, but things like pathogens and disease that can come from human activities or from changes in the environment can affect salmon health. And of course, there's hatcheries. And hatcheries are something that a lot of people have opinions on, but probably a lot of people don't fully understand hatcheries, their operating context, and that's kind of what we're here to unpack a little bit. And so when we talk about hatcheries in BC, it's important to think about the context. Hatcheries in BC started in a big way in the 1970s and early 1980s under the first phase of the Salmon Enhancement Program, and it had a mission at that time to try to double production and double catch from what was available at that time. A lot has changed since then. Hatcheries were part of that context now. A lot of people will understand hatcheries from some point along the way between when they started and what we're experiencing today. And that's kind of what we want to get into in the discussion today. So we want to be able to ask questions like, can hatcheries help with some of these conservation challenges that we're facing? What about the risks? Are all hatcheries and is all enhancement the same? Is there ultimately one answer that we can say, this is the rule that we should apply everywhere? And really, can we start to turn this to, so what should we do and how should we approach the challenges, the opportunities, and the path forward? So with that, I'm now going to just turn and introduce our panel. And I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to be speaking in a minute. So first we have Scott Hinch from University of British Columbia. Scott is somebody that I've intersected with probably throughout my professional career. He's an eminent scientist. Scott and his lab have done all kinds of stuff in the field of applied research that's informing contemporary salmon management measures. He holds a Hinch lab session once a year, and if you're lucky enough to get a seat in that, it's one of the best rooms in the province to get into and talk to people that are doing contemporary applied research for salmon. So a lot of admiration for Scott, his students, and all of the fine work that's come out of your lab. Next, we're going to have Adam Silverstein from DFO. He's currently with the Salmon Enhancement Program. I've worked with Adam when I was at DFO for probably approaching 20 years now. And Adam's somebody that's had a number of different portfolios in DFO. He's looked after major projects. He's been a regional manager for Habitat. He's managed the region for SEP operations, including community advisors and stewardship, and now he's regional manager for hatcheries and transformation. Dave Willis from DFO will come next. Dave's somebody that I first started working with in the Kamloops office, and Dave has worked from a number of different portfolios in the salmon management side. He's not somebody that has kind of come up through the ranks of SEP, but he brings perspective from the broad field of applied management issues for fisheries to his current portfolio in the Salmon Enhancement Program. And last is probably the person I know personally least well, but Megan is here from Coastal First Nations, and Megan is going to talk a little bit about some of the local perspectives, and I've had a chance to intersect with Megan in terms of some of the work that she's been trying to help coastal nations with their hatcheries and looking for ways PSF can help them. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Scott, so that we can really roll up our sleeves and get into a discussion about hatcheries. So Scott, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be here, and great to see a lot of friends and colleagues. I'm going to try to give a big picture perspective, at least from my view, on the hatchery situation that we have in British Columbia, and at least bring us all under the same umbrella of thinking when it comes to where we should be holding the discussions about how to move forward, because there's obviously a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there about hatcheries. The media is often full of divergent opinions, depending on who you talk to. And so I'd just like to start with about Canada and our hatchery production system. And we are a minor player in the global hatchery production of Pacific salmon. You can see us on the bottom there, the little tiny blue line. And certainly it's been going down in our country for some time. Above that, you've got Japan in the darker blue, also coming down, but still a significant player in the North Pacific. You have Russia in the pink, and you have the US, which is primarily Alaska, in the teal. And Russia and Alaska production continues to increase in recent years. So what does this mean to our global perspective on Pacific salmon? And so what you're looking at here is results of a paper that came out a few years ago, which I think is a really important overview of the density of fish that we have in the North Pacific. And we're talking mostly the high seas species, so sockeye, chum, and pink salmon. The one thing that stands out right away when you look at this figure is we are at record high numbers of biomass of salmon in the North Pacific. And if you look at that bottom figure of pink, look at the scale, that's actually a contracted scale compared to the other two species. So that's actually a much higher value when you place it on the same graph in terms of pink salmon numbers. So pink salmon in particular are super abundant in recent years, and you can see the little yellow portions, which are the enhancement, the hatchery component to that. And then if we add what's going on in the other side of the ocean together with the eastern side of the Pacific, you see just how many Pacific salmon we're having as adults rearing in a common ocean environment. A couple things that stand out there, again, really high production of all three of these species. The chum in particular with the Japanese hatchery systems really having a large control over those numbers. And again, if you look at the scale on the pink salmon, you'll see it's actually 3 times larger than the other two scales on those figures. So really high production of pink salmon, and in recent years, particularly enhancement of pink salmon. And so, the current takeaways from a figure like this is, we're at record high abundances. We have to recognize that. And also not evident in this figure, but if you start looking at the information more carefully, you're realizing that the number of stocks has been declining over time, yet our abundance is increasing. So we're getting more production from fewer stocks. So this is a real conservation concern as well. Okay, now another big picture issue that some work that was done out of DFO a few years with Brendan Connor and colleagues is that they're finding that distant hatchery production that we're not responsible for, is affecting our fish, affecting British Columbian sockeye. This was a paper that came out a few years ago by Brendan and others. And here's the main takeaways. Hatchery production of pink salmon in their analyses has reduced our sockeye, for example, in the southern range by 15%. Certainly, the jurisdictions like Alaska and Russia continue to increase their productions. and they're playing a major role in terms of competition for food with our fish and other stocks as well. But it really highlights the need for international cooperation, because a lot of the things that we do is going to be, that we want to see changes made, really relies on changes made at the international level as well. Another indication of how hatcheries are contributing to Pacific salmon at a broader level is a recent paper by Oak and others looking at the recent declines in body size. And so this was a good indication, again, of how density and climate are coming together to disadvantage the major salmon species in parts of Alaska. So we're looking at some significant declines in mature body sizes across all these species. And quite a significant, look at the scale there, with Chinook losing about 10 centimeters on average. So there's actually, it's younger age classes now of Chinook returning, but we see the same across all 4 species. The takeaways in their paper was the declines were caused by climate change in terms of lower food productivity, and I highlighted it, competition, largely from additional fish caused by hatcheries. We see a reduced age structure, and one of their takeaways to try to make the impact was, we're seeing average reductions in egg production, nutrient transport, fisheries value, and food for people. And they were able to put numbers on this to really drive home what this climate change and hatchery concern is. So clearly there's a need to assess effectiveness of our future hatchery programs. And I thought I was going at the end, so I said, you have heard, so I'm going at the beginning now, so you will hear, I believe. I'm going to pretend this is what's going on. We're going to hear how DFO is moving forward in this sort of effectiveness worldview. And the PSF has also done an amazing job in recent years, completing several reviews of the salmon hatchery system, one of them dealing with research and molecular tools, one dealing with release strategies and marine survival. But one I just want to pay particular note to, effectiveness of hatcheries in interactions with wild Pacific salmon, a review that Brian Riddell co-authored. Brian's in the audience, I see. And this, I thought, was a really important piece of work that was published. Here are the main takeaways from that. And Brian, I hope I get them right for you. But certainly hatchery salmon are a risk, and that's been clear in research that's been done and in this review as well, for several aspects of fish. But they can also be an important management tool if we're able to do the research, monitoring, and evaluation to assess. And as Jason mentioned, when the SET program began many years ago, we had one objective, it was the double production of salmon. Now we have so many objectives, and every hatchery seems to have different suites of objectives. And so this is going to require research and monitoring for each hatchery. And I think one of the best recommendations that I found coming out of that report was that the community involvement programs are really important because they provide outreach and public support and merits greater investment of time and money. And I think this is really important, and that leads right into this next and final overview paper that I want to mention. And that is, we need to be thinking now about how we're going to adapt our hatcheries to a world with fewer wild fish. And there was a great commentary that came out by Harrison and Brisseth earlier this year, just about trying to figure out how we're going to do this moving forward. And we're going to have to change some of the ways we think about hatcheries. Their main takeaways was that conservation in the Anthropocene is now really challenging the concept of wildness and definitions of conservation success. And so they're suggesting that for salmon that exist on the edge of climate change, like our stocks in this part of the world, where threats are unlikely to be remediated back to the status of where they once were, that we really need to think hard about what we mean by wild and what the role of conservation hatcheries and stocking in general is going to mean as it moves forward, because it becomes somewhat convoluted. And they're recommending expanding away from a primarily genetic criteria for conservation stocking to additional criteria cognizant of what we're calling hybrid ecosystems and more human-salmon relationships. And so to me, this is tying back to that recommendation of focusing a lot on the community hatcheries and the people that get involved. We need to maintain those relationships. And they're calling for these innovation solutions of conservation hatcheries, and I think that's what we're going to be hearing a little bit more about today. I'm just going to wrap up with some public perceptions of BC hatcheries. Now, I just completed a project with my lab looking at the ways to better release salmon from fisheries, recreational fisheries on our coast. And we launched a survey as well as part of that, and we asked participants, what do you think should be the main goal of salmon hatcheries? Now, all honesty here, these were largely, these were done by my lab, but largely we were focusing on anglers because that was the nature of the research. But you're going to be surprised maybe at some of the responses we got. And by the way, I'll just put a plug in if you're interested. The PSF put this up on their website. So if you want to learn more about how to release fish right, you can go to that site. Anyway, here's some specific responses by people that we interviewed. And not surprisingly, there were some that were fisheries focused. So people felt to increase the populations of Chinook and coho, which will also benefit sport fishermen. That's one of the reasons we have hatcheries. Somebody else said, I always thought hatcheries were there for providing a chance for people to go out and catch those fish to take home, right? Again, that's what SEP started as, and certainly that perspective, it maintains itself in some individuals. But we also came across a lot of conservation-focused comments to restore populations back to some kind of sustainable level. Maybe not historic, but sustainable level, to produce lots of healthy fish in different areas that are at risk. Habitat degradation and future impacts from climate change are such that hatcheries are necessary to continue to reap ecosystem services from the salmon. And in the face of climate change and a growing population, how can things survive without help these days? We've altered so much in southern BC between logging and forest fires and urbanization. It's just not realistic to have the best of both worlds. You need to help in certain situations. So there's certainly a lot of goodwill for lots of good reasons to maintain hatchery systems. But there was also equal number of concerns of people being very concerned with hatcheries. This is a great one. I'm not a huge fan of hatcheries. I think we need to minimize hatcheries. We're starting to learn more about what sort of biomass is in the North Pacific, those slides I just showed you. So I think we really need to examine how many fish we're dumping into the ocean. Hatcheries should be considered a kind of last resort. And then this one, well, it's temporary relief, right? I'm reluctant to criticize hatcheries and the people that run them, but it's no panacea. You can't buy your way out of problems. And I think this captures a lot of what people were thinking, and I highlighted the yellow part. I think it just benefits everybody. It'll benefit fishermen. It'll benefit whales if it works, and it's not a detriment to the wild fish and wild populations. And I think it really comes down to that element of assessment and doing things right. So the survey takeaway, when you put it all together, people value salmon, their ecological services, and what they can provide. This wasn't a surprise, but they see hatcheries as a tool, which if they work could help maintain sustainable populations, but they want to ensure that what they're doing is not causing more harm than good. And so in my view, clearly what we need is a science-based evaluation and monitoring system that's going to guide hatcheries in the future, which can only succeed if we foster and enhance the human-salmon connection with hatcheries. And I'm going to put this last comment up from a participant. I won't read it, but I think it says it all. And I'll end right there. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Scott. Thanks for kicking us off in a good way. I really appreciate that. You've given us a lot to think about. I could probably use the afternoon just asking you questions about everything that you showed right there. But so Scott's given us kind of a big picture perspective and now brought it back to the region. Now I'll turn to Adam Silverstein from DFO to bring some DFO perspective to this. Adam.
Thanks, Jason. Is there a clicker for the? Oh, that's it. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'd like to thank the FNFC and the PSF for this opportunity. I think this conference is a really important step, and I'm really pleased to be here. So today, rather than an overview of a particular government initiative or a program we're working on, my intention is to provide some context and some perspectives that I hope will spark the conversation that we're going to have after the presentations here around the contributions of enhancement as a tool in the broader salmon landscape. And the main thesis that I want to outline for you today is that enhancement is a key tool for salmon recovery and resilience, but we have important work to do to ensure that we're using it effectively. My colleague Ryan Galbraith likes to talk about it as a tool, as a hammer, that you can build things or you can break things. And in my view, that choice isn't a binary one. Hopefully, this panel that we've got today is going to engage more people in addressing some of the barriers to more effective use of this tool. So there's lots of different ways to talk about a broad and complex subject like hatcheries. And most frequently what I get asked from people in my day-to-day life is, are they good or are they bad? And I don't think that's the best question that we can ask, but I'm gonna come back to that point in a few minutes. So salmon recovery and resilience depends on millions of factors across a huge geography. Scott talked a little bit about some of those factors. But overall, we kind of have these three main categories of interventions that we can take to reach our objectives: harvest, habitat, and hatcheries. And all three of these levers have potential effects on the others. They each have a dynamic history and a current framework for our interventions. But we need to pay attention to all three, and all three are needed. And so in my view, a key part of this conference is about how we use all of these tools and the interactions between them. So in BC, we have 4 primary goals that we use enhancement for harvest, for stock assessment, for conservation and rebuilding, and for stewardship and engagement. And while there's a variety of perspectives about the use of this tool across BC, hatcheries right now are a key part of the current salmon landscape, and they represent a valuable resource of infrastructure, expertise, and capacity to contribute to salmon abundance. The Salmon Enhancement Program is currently making a significant contribution to many different fisheries. Hatcheries are helping to sustain COSEWIC-listed populations and to prevent others from being listed. They're helping us meet our obligations under the Pacific Salmon Treaty and providing important assessment information for management decisions. And they support education and engagement with stewards, thousands of stewards all across the region. And I think it's important to continue this work. However, there are gaps and challenges in this network, and there are many opportunities for us to improve and adjust. There's also a growing interest in using this tool to respond to the salmon abundance concerns we're seeing across the region. And we're working with partners to modernize our infrastructure and even build some new infrastructure to support the ability to use enhancement to meet these goals. But if we're going to do this effectively, we need a systematic approach to doing so. So without a doubt, hatcheries can help us contribute to salmon abundance. They can help reduce the likelihood of extirpation. They can provide important information or experimental platforms, but they also can have negative impacts. They carry a variety of biological risks. They can result in unforeseen consequences, and they're really expensive to build and operate and maintain. They are not a blanket solution to salmon abundance concerns or to fisheries access. But all of the different interventions we take to help manage salmon result in different trade-offs: environmental, economic, social, cultural. And I think this concept of trade-offs is very important to look at how we can use the tools we have more effectively. More on this in a minute. I think the other really important thing to note is that change is here, as many other presentations have said, and more is coming. The landscape around these different levers we have to pull has changed dramatically, and it continues to evolve really rapidly. Ocean conditions, freshwater habitat conditions, indigenous interests, major weather events, all are changing, and the pace at which they're changing is increasing. That context also means that some of the threats for salmon in BC cannot be mitigated, and there's going to be much greater variability in the conditions and in the results from any interventions that we take. So there is a need to make sure that enhancement is evolving and adapting to this changing environment, but I think we're going to need this tool to meet our desires for salmon outcomes across the region. And so in this context of change and threats and need for tools, it's my view that whether hatcheries are good or bad is not a very informative question. I think we're going to need all the tools we have to face this wicked problem. And I think the more important questions we have to ask ourselves are do we have clearly identified and hopefully quantified objectives for hatchery production? Is the hatchery actually contributing to those outcomes? And do those outcomes fit with assessment, fisheries management, and habitat systems that we have in place? I think one of the most important things that we can do moving forward is to be much more specific and quantified about our objectives for hatchery management. We can't define success if we don't have a goal, And we can't quantify the trade-offs we're making searching for that success unless we get more specific both about what we're seeking and what the costs are of getting there. So I think collectively, as we work towards salmon recovery and resilience, if we're going to take bold action, we need to support more risk management and not just practice risk avoidance. I think also because of the technical complexity, the infrastructure, the variety of interests that may benefit or be impacted by enhancement, broad systematic change is really challenging. This doesn't mean we shouldn't shoot for real change, but rather identify the most effective ways to doing so. Over my career, one of the things I've observed is that incremental change in the direction of key principles and objectives is a more successful approach than trying to change the whole system. And so DFO's hatchery adaptation or draft hatchery adaptation strategy is part of our efforts to provide some of this direction and to work with partners to do so. So you're going to hear more about it in a few moments from my colleague Dave Willis, but we're working to improve the tools and processes we have to evaluate and quantify the trade-offs that are part of hatchery management decisions. But that work requires engagement and information sharing with lots of different partners. And one of the gaps that I would like to point out in BC is that there are many places, organizations, academic institutions, and others involved in research and advocacy for fisheries management, for stock assessment, for habitat management, but there are actually very few that are focused and dedicated around this lever of enhancement. There's a lack of knowledge outside of the Salmon Enhancement Program and DFO about hatchery programming and its results in BC. And so we need to increase the knowledge and understanding of this tool and the number of people that are sharing this information. Hatcheries are neither inherently good nor inherently bad, and oversimplifying their role is not helpful for the complex problems that salmon are facing. Hatcheries can be part of the solution for salmon recovery and resilience, but without appropriate effort and adjustment, they're going to be part of the problem. Excuse me. So, enhancement decisions frequently require these multidimensional trade-offs with benefits and impacts that accrue often to different groups in different places. And in those situations, it can be much easier to maintain the status quo than it is to take bold new direction. But trade-off decisions are required to make sure that we're using our resources effectively, to maximize the benefits from this tool, and to manage the risks associated with it. In increasingly polarized environments for decision-making, we need to find ways to encourage experimentation at different scales in different locations with different approaches that offer different compromises. And we're actively working towards this, and we want to collaborate with others to do this. And Dave Willis is going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. So those of us that are working on these salmon management questions know that any effective actions are going to have to be tailored at local, regional, and even international scales. And the PSF has proposed a governance model for a Made in BC solution, how this might work. And I'd like to encourage all of you to reflect on how the Salmon Enhancement Program and hatcheries in BC might fit into such a model. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and looking forward to the conversation.
You're determined to break that.
Yeah, I know. It keeps it doesn't go off the edge.
Thanks, Adam. And thank you, Adam. And just a reminder, we're going to hold questions till all four presenters are done. So if you're thinking of one, just keep it noted, and we'll come to it as soon as we can. So now Dave Willis to pick up from where Adam left off and to talk about some of the DFO transition thinking. So Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. All right, let's get this all together. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be here. My name is David Willis. So I am the section head of the hatchery reform team in the Salmon Enhancement Program of DFO. Today I'm going to be talking with you about some of the new approaches that we are taking in salmon enhancement at DFO that we believe will help our salmon hatchery programs continue to be a piece of the puzzle that is salmon recovery and resilience now and moving into the future. All right, so starting off, salmon enhancement is complicated. So you've heard a lot about the complex environment already today in Adam's talk and previous talks, but salmon enhancement itself has a bunch of additional complicated pieces to it. The more that I've learned about it, the more that I realize that I don't know very much about it, and I have a lot more to learn. So I'm going to begin by discussing this complexity with you and all the different layers and factors that are important in considering how we develop and plan an effective salmon hatchery program. Next, I'll talk about how DFO is taking a new and adaptive approach to addressing this complexity. We're advancing several initiatives under what we call the hatchery adaptation strategy. I'll outline this strategy, talk about some examples of how it's being applied on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and wrap up with some closing thoughts on hatcheries and their role in salmon management. As I said, salmon enhancement is complicated. So what I hear a lot, though, from a lot of people is that people think salmon enhancement's pretty straightforward. You just take some eggs out of a fish, put them in a hatchery, release them, that's it. But in reality, that's just one very, very small part of the overall process and all the considerations that have to go into thinking about how we use this tool. So salmon enhancement shouldn't just be considered a biological process, but also we need to look at its societal components. Designing an effective hatchery program needs to consider a lot of different factors. This includes the growing and evolving scientific knowledge, so a lot of different knowledge sources. We're learning more and more about the interaction of hatchery fish with wild populations. Environmental variability, increasing significant impacts there. We've heard a lot about that today. Highly variable but overall declining trends in salmon abundance in British Columbia. Indigenous rights and relationships, this is a big piece in our evolving context around salmon enhancement and management. And of course, the values of the communities that live around salmon and that depend on salmon. So I like to think of a salmon enhancement program kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. There's a lot of different pieces that need to go into it. At the beginning, you might not know what it's going to look like at the end until you start putting it together. And in our case, it's like we're kind of putting it together on a table that's always shifting around and moving a lot. And you have a lot of different people around with a lot of different opinions about how it should be put together. So it's a complicated endeavor. So a few years ago, a group of us in DFO sat down and tried to think about this and deconstruct this puzzle. We asked ourselves, moving into the future, what would the steps and actions need to be taken in order to design and implement an effective salmon enhancement program? And when I say effective, what I mean is a hatchery program that sets really clear goals about what it's trying to do, assesses those goals, meets them, and knows that it meets them by assessing them, and also minimizes negative outcomes in the process. So this resulting flow chart was a snapshot of some of our work that we did when we tried to break down this process. What we looked at, it was pretty complicated. So we identified a series of steps, some of them that were already in place and worked well in the entire salmon enhancement process. Some steps that we thought needed some work, needed to be advanced, and there were a bunch of other steps we looked at and said, this would be something that needs to happen, but there hasn't been any work on it yet. So it hasn't even started yet. So this really complicated flow chart became the foundation of what is now developing into the hatchery adaptation strategy. So the hatchery adaptation strategy. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is, why we need it, who it's for, and how it's being developed. So in brief, what this strategy is, it's a comprehensive review of how we use our hatchery programs from start to finish. So what it does is it looks through all those different steps and it prioritizes the actions that focus on addressing some of the weaker points in that system, right from the beginning of planning a hatchery program all the way through implementing to assessing and then post-program monitoring. So in the past, some of these weaknesses have at times left hatchery programs slow to respond to change, or sometimes less effective than they could have otherwise been. So the hatchery adaptation strategy aims to break down the complexity. It aims to break down into some of the individual discrete steps into smaller, manageable pieces and provide the tools and approaches to enable adaptive and responsive management for the evolving future that we know is coming. So why do we need this? Well, there's been a lot of talk already about how things are changing. I won't talk about this too much. Environment changing, fisheries changing, Indigenous communities are stepping up and expecting more. So our hatchery system has to be able to adapt and change and adjust better than it has in the past. So this isn't just about change for the sake of change. It's about enabling thoughtful and strategic change that improves outcomes moving into the future. So what the strategy is intended to be for and who it's for anyone that's involved in planning, managing, and operating hatcheries, both directly and indirectly. So this includes, of course, us and DFO, our community partners and Indigenous partners that operate hatcheries, but also anyone else who works with hatcheries. So people like Scott's group who work with some of the community hatcheries, a range of academics, a range of First Nations groups. Different groups work at different scales, whether it be a lot of groups work with a single population on a river, others work with larger geographic aggregates. The strategy is intended to help provide a consistent approach across those scales, just to guide a better and more consistent approach to hatchery management at all these levels. And so how is the strategy being developed? So it's not being developed from scratch. That's a really important piece here. So what this work has done is it looked to a lot of the work that's been done in the past, including the wild salmon policy, the United States hatchery reform process, and also the Pacific Salmon Foundation's recent hatchery effectiveness review, as well as many other pieces of work out of DFO and other jurisdictions. So the strategy itself includes 6 objectives that span the entire life cycle of a hatchery program, right from the initial pre-planning component, even before the decision's actually even been made to have a hatchery, whether this should or shouldn't be used, all the way through implementation and monitoring at the end. So if you're familiar with the United States hatchery reform process at all, or the wild salmon policy, you'll probably recognize some of the wording in here, in these objectives. A lot of these objectives align directly with recommendations that came from the wild salmon policy or the United States hatchery reform process. Excuse me. So these 6 objectives point to opportunities to be able to address some of those more common barriers to hatchery effectiveness and adaptation and to enabling change that we identified when we were doing that review of the hatchery process. I should point out that within these objectives, there is a series of corresponding actions. I'm not going to get into those today, but they are all in the draft adaptation strategy, which can be shared with anyone who is interested in seeing it. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of these actions and concepts are being applied in a case study, West Coast of Vancouver Island, Chinook. So the first pilot I'm going to talk about sounds straightforward, but really it's anything but. And that's around setting goals. So that's really a key first step. If you think back to that flow chart I showed at the beginning, it's like the very first step. You have to have a clear goal. So having clear goals, it's kind of like when I compared to a jigsaw puzzle, the way I look at it is setting really clear objectives is kind of like starting to put the corners and the edges around the jigsaw puzzle. It makes the next steps a lot easier to start filling in the rest of the pieces and understanding where you need to go. Oops, sorry. There's my jigsaw puzzle. Consider at this point the jigsaw puzzle dumped out. All right, so this figure here, oops, sorry. Sorry, I skipped over something there. Just to give a little bit of background on Vancouver Island itself, though, west coast of Vancouver Island. So it is a complicated situation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. We have a lot of fish there, most of them from hatcheries, very, very significant fisheries that are produced, but supported by those hatchery programs. Natural production and wild status is poor, particularly in some areas like Clayoquot Sound. We know there's been significant interactions between hatchery fish and wild fish there. A lot of interest from First Nations. We have the Manulth Treaty Nations. We have rights-based fisheries on the west coast of the island. DFO works closely with Nuu-chah-nulth tribes as well. So layer on that the Pacific Salmon Treaty as well as Fisheries Act, Fish Stock Provisions Rebuilding Plan. It just adds more and more layers of complexity. So a lot of complexity here. All right, sorry, back on track here. So as I was saying, setting these goals is really, really, really important right off the bat. So this figure that I'm showing here is from a report by Ruth Whittler. What it's showing is the genetic composition of Chinook salmon in rivers up and down the west coast of Vancouver Island. So many of these rivers have hatcheries, some don't. The rivers that have hatchery programs, but even the ones that don't, they're being managed to different objectives sometimes. So the colors that you're seeing there are the genetic composition of those populations. And you can see some patterns, and they mostly align along the different sounds and the conservation units. But there are some things that really stand out here. So there's some colors that go a lot farther than others. There are other colors that you can see some outliers, some pink and some red that's popping up far from other pieces of those colors. So what we're seeing there are effects from hatcheries that are that have been discovered where fish have been straying into other populations, and ultimately where the intended effects of hatchery programs, basically we saw some unintended effects from hatchery programs that don't align with any of the goals from hatcheries there. So some of the work that we're doing now under this strategy, DFO is working with several nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island to work with them to set clear goals for Chinook populations affected by enhancement. But as you can see in this figure, the decisions that may be made in one place can have effects, or can affect outcomes a long ways away. And this is something that we've been learning more and more about and having to consider. So we need to have a really clear picture of the goals at the watershed, the individual watershed levels, but we also need to be able to put those together and work up to a West Coast wide level to be able to have an effective hatchery program there. So for example, in some of the work that's ongoing right now with First Nations there, when setting goals, when talking with communities, we'll talk with them about the Chinook populations in their territory and about what their goals and visions are for those populations and how enhancement may or may not play a role for the positive or negative. So what we hear, some communities tell us that they prioritize wild salmon values. That comes overall, and they're willing to give up abundance for that. Other communities tell us that they're prioritizing economic access and economic opportunities, and if that comes at the expense of some wild salmon values, then that's something that they're prioritizing in their communities. But ultimately, what we hear from many is they're looking for a balance of both. And what we actually do hear a lot is we want both. We want lots of abundance from hatcheries, but we want to protect wild salmon values. So the challenge here and the task is to be able to try to find a way to balance and identify those trade-offs, and using some of the structured tools that we've developed and analytical tools, understand what is and isn't possible, because in a lot of cases, it's not possible to have both of those outcomes. A lot of salmon to catch, but also strong wild salmon values. So using a structured, science-based approach, we're working with these nations to support values-based goal setting. This ensures that the enhancement plans that are developed align with clearly defined goals and consider habitat, harvest, and trade-offs. All right, so within some of these populations that we're working with nations on around setting goals, such as the Namint River, Sarita River, Burman, Clayoquot Sound, Tassis, Kanuma, there are a range of other actions and tools that are and innovative work that's underway as part of this work on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So there's a range of new marking and genetic management programs that's been initiated. This is a really important piece around monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, but also understanding risks to wild salmon and impacts across the west coast of the island. A range of other new types of tagging techniques, parentage-based tagging, pit tagging, fit chips, some work that Christy Miller's started on the west coast for us to understand smolt condition when they're being released. All these tools are just aimed at improving monitoring and understanding of hatchery programs. Some other new conservation tools that are being implemented in some of these areas where we know we have severe conservation problems, strictly as a tool to prevent extinction. So techniques like cryopreservation, broodstock ultrasound, captive breeding. These are tools that we're using, or at least considering and refining, to be able to be used in places where the goals are around preventing extirpation of populations. And lastly, a focus on assessment, research, and experimentation, and especially in partnerships with universities, First Nations, and other external groups. So this is critical for us to understand the effectiveness of our hatchery programs and be able to manage them adaptively, and ultimately improve our understanding of hatchery effects on salmon and salmon populations to make sure that we can focus efforts where they're most likely to succeed and reduce efforts when they're not succeeding. So in that jigsaw puzzle analogy, I look at these different actions like starting to put the pieces in. Now that we have the edge around with the goals, they're starting to put a few more pieces in place. So the puzzle's starting to get a bit more clear. All right, a few closing thoughts here. So hatchery adaptation is not a one-time effort. It needs to be a way of thinking. change is hard, but it's important. Today's solutions can potentially become tomorrow's problems. So we have to stay flexible and be willing to change in our hatchery programs and how we manage those populations. The problems that we're dealing with are big, and solutions can seem daunting. There's a lot coming at us, but I think it's important that stress that incremental change is important, and incremental change does and can add up to big, major change. Collaboration and leadership is key at all levels, and this is key to success. DFO can help with leadership and coordination, but leadership from First Nations and from communities and all over is really important. And lastly, I think just by being clear-eyed, thoughtful, and adaptive, I do believe that salmon enhancement can continue to support salmon recovery and resilience long into the future by supporting salmon populations as well as the communities and people that depend on them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks for not dropping the pointer 14 times like Adam did. Appreciate that. Okay, I'll invite our last speaker, Megan Moody from Coastal First Nations up. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Megan because it was pretty late in the game when we got around to inviting her to be part of this panel. And she gamely accepted our invitation, and we're really pleased to have her. And thank you for accommodating us on short notice. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Move this down a little bit. I'm shorter than everyone. Hoping I can see my slides. But good afternoon, everyone. Honored to be here and presenting today. A little bit about myself. I'm a member of the New Hulk Nation. My traditional name is Tskoyoch. I'm here, the New Hulk Nation is out of Bella Coola on the central coast of BC. And I'm here working for an alliance of First Nations. So Coastal First Nations is an alliance of 8 different nations on the Central Coast, North Coast, and Haida Gwaii. So I'm basically here to speak to their work and how Coastal First Nations supports that work. So they do all the good, hard work on the grounds, and we're there to support them. So I just want to stress that because it's very important that we recognize the work that's done in the communities. All right, so just to give a glimpse of where I'm speaking to, so Haida Gwaii, so there's one hatchery on the north end of Haida Gwaii, the Gitgat Nation, which is in the north coast, and 6 different, I'm going to call them programs because they're not all hatcheries. So, for example, my nation works with a federal facility, which is Snootley Creek Hatchery. But the other Kitasoo Jejes have 2 hatcheries, and the Heltzik have 2 hatcheries. So we're talking about 8 different community programs in our alliance of nations. So what I do is I work for the regional organization, so we represent all of them, and our role is to provide management and coordination support to the member nations. And we collaborate with participating governments, such as DFO, funders, and other partners, such as PSF, to support the nations and advance, with the goal of advancing their salmon enhancement and restoration efforts in this area. Some of this support includes coordination of upgrades to these facilities. So some of these facilities have not been upgraded in 30+ years, and through the BC Shrift Grant, we were able to get a bunch of money to support upgrading the facilities over the past 3 years. We also provide support for troubleshooting operational issues. So with hatcheries, there's all sorts of stuff that pops up, and especially in small communities. So we support troubleshooting these and providing support to fix things. We also provide on-site fish technical support and coordinating educational opportunities to refresh and enhance community members' technical skills, fish culture, and fish health skills. And this is a picture of one of the runs, a chum run in the Kitasoo Creek. So why do this work? It might be the big question here is, from a community perspective, what is the importance of salmon to our nations, and what is the role of hatcheries in our nations? So number one, food security. We want to be able, I think I heard yesterday in some of the Tier 1 sessions that, salmon is our life, it's part of our culture, it's part of who we are, and we all want to be able to catch a fish every year. Healthy ecosystems. We are part of the ecosystem, so not just talking about the trees and the bears and how the fish feed them, but we are all part of the ecosystem. And if it's healthy, we're healthy. Conservation enhancement has been really coming up in our work, is that we want to help the stocks of concern in our territories. So we all know salmon's in a crisis, and we're seeing this, so we want to be able to do conservation enhancement work. We want technical skills to also exist in our communities and be able to continue to do the work in our communities, and we want them to stay in our communities. So it's really important that we continue this work on a regular basis. Emergency enhancement is also something we're looking to do, which basically using our hatcheries for not just production or conservation, but to be able to react to the emergency situations we're seeing on a seasonal basis. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And these are just some of our technicians working on the projects. Give you a snapshot of our hatcheries. So you'll see all the hatchery and the hatchery programs. They are a variety of hatcheries. You can see one of them, probably the oldest, is initiated in 1977. So our communities have hatcheries programs for quite a while. And up to the new ones, where the newest one, Percy Walker's Hatchery out of Rivers Inlet, the Uwikino Nation, is probably the newest. And we do all species from Chinook, Coho, chum, sockeye in some cases. And they can range from larger facilities, such as up to 2 million. These are our production targets, so we don't necessarily reach them every year, but down to maybe 7,000 to 10,000 fish in some areas. So definitely smaller hatcheries, not the larger scale facilities we see. Some of the unique elements and challenges of our facilities are that they're all remote sites. So they're all coastal, they're all remote. They, in some cases, are remote to our villages. So, for example, Bella Bella has a hatchery, and you still have to travel 40 minutes from Bella Bella to get to the hatchery. So they're challenging, but and they're smaller, but they're all community run with dedicated staff that need to be able to problem solve quickly on their own. So you need to be kind of a jack of all trades to be able to run these facilities. A couple of guys in Haida Gwaii, they'll tromp through 2 feet of snow to get to their egg shack to check on the eggs in the winter. And some of them are only powered by either a generator or a small hydroelectric facility or system. And there's very limited technical support available from outside, so we really need to be able to have our staff comfortable in problem solving and being able to react to anything that can come up on a whim's notice. So general operations are unfortunately expensive, and I learned quite well as the past 3 years about doing upgrades and learning about pipes and water intakes and you name it. Anyways, funding is limited. We were very fortunate to get the last bit of SHRIF money to really upgrade the facilities to hopefully take us over the next couple decades. So, as I said, minimal repairs since inception. Just to give you a glance of what one of our hatcheries looks like, this is the Yaqoon River Hatchery in Haida Gwaii. Like I said, it's probably about 70 kilometers from Masset. You can see it's a lake pen. The top picture there is a lake pen and a longhouse accommodation. So the crew will stay up there for a month or two during egg take season. And the far left picture is what it looked like probably a couple years ago before we started the upgrades. And the staff, we worked with the staff to get the money, and they basically, local contractors and milling of their own wood to upgrade the accommodations. One thing I just wanted to highlight in the upgrades was this sea pens and lake pens that were really key. Over the past 5 years, some of them haven't been operational. And through the access to funds and working together, we were able to redo the one on the left is the Kitasoo Creek Hatchery, brand new sea pens. Same with McLaughlin Hatchery out of Bella Bella, and then we upgraded all the walkway around the Yaccoon lake pens. So that's not a sea at the bottom, but it's a lake. But it was, again, community-driven and managed projects. And then I just wanted to highlight some of the changes we're seeing, and this is, we're witnessing on a annual basis. So this was this year, the Kitasoo Creek Hatchery. We went from drought conditions where the fish are holding, and then we go to flood conditions within days. So these are some of the emergency situations we want to be able to react to and to be able to manage. So we're in the midst of figuring out how to build up the dikes a little bit more, and this is a brand new facility, so we want to make sure that we can protect it for future use. And that was probably the worst flood I think they've seen in a long while. And then I just wanted to highlight this one. I'm sure you've seen this on Twitter and X, but this was in Bella Bella, the Nekus River, a couple years ago, where 65,000 dead pink dried up before spawning. And this is what we're seeing, and the communities are seeing this, and we want to be able to react as quick as possible and use hatcheries as we can. This one was pretty shocking to see, but just wanted to highlight what we're seeing on the grounds. So what are the opportunities we see for our hatcheries moving ahead is that we want to take a holistic approach to salmon. We want to stabilize salmon habitat in this crazy climate we're seeing, but we want to combine protection, restoration with enhancement. So not just enhancement's going to solve everything, but we want to restore our habitats and protect the fish that are there. We also want continuous training for our technicians and provide opportunities. Meaningfully involve our youth is one thing. We always say we want to involve our youth, but we want to do that in a meaningful way. And this is everyone I heard yesterday very clearly in the Tier 1 session that we need to figure out how to do this. Because running a hatchery is complex, and we need to, like I said, we need to be able to train our youth from an early age. I started out actually as a student at Snootley Creek Hatchery when I was about 16, so I've come full circle. I've done all sorts of things, and hatcheries was one of the things that really, I think, inspired me to get involved in conservation and fisheries. So there is a good, interesting aspect to hatcheries that is something that we should pay attention to when we want to teach and recruit our youth. Continuous upkeep and maintenance of our facilities is key. We also want to be able to network between nations to share skills, advice on what we're seeing on the grounds across our territories. We've been doing a bit of this, and I'm seeing it as very important to be able to share skills and insight into what we're seeing. So building that network, we have a network between our nations, but we also would love to expand that to other communities. So I saw a few other communities presenting on hatcheries yesterday, and feel free to reach out. We also need to review our existing community goals. Some of our hatcheries are I don't want to say outdated, but like some of the, we need to be able to adapt our enhancement plans. Some of them are still based on production, and we need to move towards, conservation and what are our goals, and can we move around and adapt our strategies from when they start. It's like I said, some of them are 30 years old. And like I said, an emergency enhancement, we don't know how to make this happen quite yet, but we want the process to be nimble so that we can make it happen as we're seeing it happen in real time. We're doing a lot of good work, and this is like assessment, catch monitoring, stream restoration. All of our communities are doing all this different good work, and we want to be able to integrate our enhancement work so we can use it to be most effective. And best utilize the hatcheries to match our community goals. So that is probably one of the most important things to do. All right, I'm going to stop there, and this is thank you in many of our nation's languages. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to invite our panelists up. Everybody come and grab a seat. I see we're running a little tight on time, so I'm not going to use my moderator's prerogative to pose a question to the panel. I'll turn to the room right away. So if you've been sitting on a question and would like to pose it to the panel, just put your hand up, and we've got Raphael or his team mic runner there, thank you, to take a question. So does anybody from the floor have a question they want to put to the panel? Just throw your hand up. If not, I will use moderator's prerogative. Okay. Oh, and I'm going to go first, if you don't mind. I'll just flip this to the panel, and you're welcome to take it or leave it, and I'll come and join you in a minute. But I teed Scott up for this because he was sitting beside me. If you could do one thing based on either your talk or other talks, if you could recommend one thing, what would it be?
Sure, I have 3 things, but I'll start with one. My group's been working with the Mossam Creek Community Hatchery now for a few years, and trying to help them modify their release practices. The one thing we've realized is that every hatchery, especially the community ones, they're so different in terms of what their objectives are, their local environments, and some of the more local issues that they have to deal with. And so every hatchery is somewhat unique, but I think what is common amongst all of them is trying to figure out what is the right size and right timing to release your fish, and where do you release them. And so I would like to see a program where we're investigating this at all of our smaller hatcheries, supported by DFO and other groups, as they've been doing with this one case, and using an experimental approach so that we can examine question by question. In this case, we're saying, what's the best place to release them? And this is a long-term answer, because we've marked fish and we want to see what happens when they come back. So I'd really like to see that, and that information that we've learned then spread amongst the entire network, and getting information back from what others have learned, because I think we're just kind of doing this because we've always done it this way, and I think there's a lot of new things we could learn, and we're not necessarily learning.
Thanks, Scott. Would any of the other panelists like to take a shot at that question? If you could do one thing, or if you could recommend one thing, what would it be? I think it's on me. It should be.
I think we need to review all of our plans, and it would include everything such as, how big to grow your fish, how many fish to produce, what fish does the communities want to produce. So I think just reviewing our goals and then learning from each other's strategies is key. And I think we all want to have that discussion, but we sometimes get too wrapped up in the day-to-day, and all of a sudden a year's gone by, and so I think, taking the time to plan, especially with climate change and the changes we're seeing now, is probably most important.
Well, could I just follow up with you on that? Like, what would it take to unlock that? What kind of help or support or system change would you need to help make that real?
Time or capacity. I would love to have a team put together that could because we are doing a bit of a pilot to kind of analyze one of our programs, It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort to have those good discussions in communities to make sure that you are taking into consideration everybody's views and products. So unfortunately, it takes time, which a lot of us struggle with.
Yeah, I'm nodding because people that know me know I worked in DFO. SEP was part of the side of the shop I worked on. And I think that time and capacity, they go together. It's part of the complexity of actually running a hatchery, right? Or doing enhancement. It's not just take some eggs, run some water, hatch them, and let them go. You need to follow it up with the assessment to do the science. And these are things that I think have been eroded from the capacity of the system, or maybe even never existed within the capacity of the system. And they're not going to come online by accident. So, raising them and then being deliberate about trying to address these needs is an important thing that we should be thinking about. But before I just go to the audience, Adam or Dave, do either of you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I've got one thing to add. For me, I think the science, research, and monitoring component, and having dedicated capacity. The vast majority of what we've learned and the science that we lean on comes from other jurisdictions. And that's changing, that's growing, but I think having Canadian hatchery science expertise and knowledge, it's growing, and to me that continues to be even more important for what we're doing.
Adam, quick
Yeah,
one.
I mean, I much like the others, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there is that one thing that we could do that is going to improve this. But I do think there is important work to be done to maximize the use of what we do have and to be more efficient in using that. There are things that are happening out there now that could shift and adjust and improve the outcomes that we're seeing from this tool. And so,
Could you be a little more specific? That's vague to me. Important work to be done to make use of this tool. Give an example.
Well, I think there are places where hatchery production needs to be adjusted to align with the modern context. There are places where there may be production that is for a fishery that is no longer happening, and that could be adjusted to conservation needs, or that fishery could be created in a more terminal and selective way to take advantage of that production. So it cuts both ways.
Let me just pick that up. I'll ask you the same question I asked Megan. What would it take to turn that on?
Well, I think, as the others have outlined, it takes that people in a place over time to make some of those shifts, because there's always winners and losers in those shifts, right? There are those that are going to have a benefit or a perceived benefit right now that they think will be shifted, and there are winners and losers in that process, and that's a really difficult process, I think, and I think that's a struggle for lots of aspects of salmon management. But it's important to acknowledge that and to try and maybe even quantify it to help people make an informed decision, because just doing what you did last year is not an effective solution either.
Thanks. Owen, I jumped you in the queue there, so do you have a mic? Oh, yeah, maybe just try speaking loudly, see if that works.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't want to speculate off the top of my head about that 2020 year, but the one quick guess I'll offer you is COVID, right? COVID dramatically changed conditions and the fisheries in that year, and so it likely has something to do with that. In terms of the marking question, I think marking, and there are lots of different types of marking. It's not just adipose fin clipping, but marking is a very important tool to better understand hatcheries. And we should be marking hatchery production. But like the other decisions we take around hatcheries, there are trade-offs with that. Once fish are marked, people are going to look for an opportunity to selectively harvest those marked fish. And there are many different fisheries that could be enabled through that marking. It might be a terminal indigenous fishery. It might be a mixed stock sport fishery. And all of those come with different trade-offs. And they also come with concern because the fisheries management decision is made, this year, but the marking decision has to be made years in advance to enable that. So to me, I think marking is a very important tool, and we should be doing more of it for the purposes of hatchery management. But in terms of fishery management decisions, I think that's a different kettle of fish, and we need to think carefully about the work we're doing at hatcheries and how that ties to our objectives around both fisheries management and conservation.
Thanks. I know, Owen, you asked if others could comment on that. We've only got about 3.5 minutes left in our countdown. I wouldn't mind getting another question from the audience. There's one in the back. Aaron, I'll come to you after if we have time. Go ahead in the back.
Here's a question. So where or how are you finding success with Indigenous participation in the operations and management of hatcheries?
Well, how do you answer that? Were you asking that of the people from the federal government side or from anybody on the panel?
Anybody on the panel that would like to answer it, but probably Megan for sure.
Do you want to start, Megan? And then we can maybe add a quick comment.
So where are we finding
Success
success?
with Indigenous participation in hatchery operations and management.
Well, we're operating all of the hatcheries on our own, but I think, we could definitely, I don't know how to define what you're saying, but I think we're being successful in running the facilities, if that. And we work with DFO, but it is limited. Community programs. I think we might be successful because we are doing them, and they have been run for that long. I can't say the same for facilities that aren't First Nations run or community run. So that might pass that over to you guys. But I feel like ours are successful because we are operating them, and they are community run. They're supported by DFO, but generally they're completely run by the nations.
Do you want to add a quick comment, like 30 seconds?
I think part of defining success is what is the objective, and so what is the objective of the nation, and that varies greatly across the network of hatcheries that we have. But I think there are lots of places that Indigenous people and nations are getting access to fish, access to training, they're operating their own facilities. There are places where we're working towards the development of new facilities with Indigenous groups and having joint objective setting for those facilities. And so to me, I think there's a range, but it depends on what the objectives of that nation is, and we need to work with them to ensure that the work we're doing contributes to those objectives.
All right. Aaron, I'm hesitating to ask you a question. We've got a minute left. I don't want to keep people late. Is it a quick one that you want to get out on the floor, and maybe we could tackle it after the session breaks? Okay, sure. Grab the mic and we'll at least hear the question.
Sure. So DFO's moving to open new mark select fisheries, and it's probably going to drive pressure for more hatchery production. Dr. Hinch's recent research, which was supported by PSF and others, show that there's some pretty significantly high mortality rates on released, unmarked, or wild fish in those fisheries. And when you apply that to the hundreds of thousands of fish that are released in in fisheries in BC, you could be looking at a lot of wild fish being killed, maybe more being killed than are being saved, depending on how you look at it. So I was just kind of wondering if the panel would discuss that and the implications for hatchery planning and production.
So I don't want to keep the room late. So does anybody have like a 30-second comment on Aaron's question? Because it's a fair question.
It's a good question, and I guess if you read our entire report that we wrote, we also have 15 recommendations on how to minimize those risks. And in some cases, they can be quite minimal, but granted, in some cases, they're not. So I think it's really context specific. So it's not all wild fish of all types that would necessarily suffer equally high levels of mortality. I think it can be quite low, but again, it's the context. Yeah.
Well, and Aaron, I think your question deserves a deeper dive, but we'll be around. I think, I'd welcome you to find people from the panel. I'd love to sit here and, debate that with you in the room all night. But to be fair to the room, we said we would end at 4:30. We're just a little bit over time, but I'm going to wrap us. I'd like a round of applause, if you don't mind, to thank the panelists who've taken the time to present. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for spending your time with us in the afternoon breakout session on this. I think we could talk a lot more, and if there's an appetite for this, I think PSF, along with other partners, would be happy to provide some kind of platform to continue and extend these kinds of conversations. I think they're good for the resource. They're good for those of us that are participating in the stewardship and conservation of these fish, and it's what we need to do, I think, to make best use of the opportunities and to ask the right kinds of questions to manage effectively in the future. So thank you for spending time with us today, and I hope you'll join us for the mingle. I'm not sure if everybody knows, but there's kind of a reception time now down in the foyer where we can hang out and maybe dig into questions like this further. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you in the mingle.